The New Politics of the Great Depression. For this module, this particular lecture will focus on the economic crisis and political change that the Great Depression of the 1930s brought about, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, African Americans in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, Black protests during the Great Depression, and we'll end with some references to the Scottsboro case, which I'd like for you to read in your textbook, read about in your textbook. I think it's at the beginning of chapter 16, but I'll give you some page numbers. The economic crisis that led to the Great Depression of the 1930s began in the seeming prosperity of the 1920s. Over-speculation in the stock market stimulated growth in American business. As the rest of the world struggled with the economic aftermath of World War I, American bankers refused to adjust or forgive debts that had been extended to support war expenses. American tariffs and income taxes brought millions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury, but little of this trickled down into the nation's economic system. For African Americans, the economic crisis began in the mid-1920s. Blacks who remained in the South suffered through general agricultural downturns in the 1920s as European farmers recovered and became more competitive with American farmers. Natural disasters like infestations of boll weevils, droughts, and floods also contributed to difficulties in the agricultural sector. Things were also difficult for blacks who migrated to the Northeast and the Midwest. Returning veterans and European immigrants came back into the job market to compete with migrating black workers in the nation's industrial sector. Blacks were, in many cases, the last hired and the first fired. The stock market crash of 1929 brought more unemployment and immediate cuts in domestic service jobs, the mainstay of black communities. Those who continued to work often did so for starvation wages. By 1923, 25 to 40% of African Americans in several large urban centers were on public relief or private relief. This was 3 to 4 times the number of whites. By 1934, 17% of whites and 38% of blacks were unable to support themselves. By 1935, 1/4 of the 1.5 million black domestic workers were on relief. In some cities, the numbers were even higher than this average. 65% of blacks in Atlanta and 80% in Norfolk, Virginia, were on some kind of public assistance by the mid-1930s. For black farmers, times were even harder. This was particularly important, the case for black workers in cotton and sugar, working on cotton and sugar farms. These workers faced lower prices, or farmers or landowners faced lower prices. There was less demand for sharecroppers and tenant farmers because the landowners were receiving lower prices for their products. They in turn forced many sharecroppers and tenant farmers off of the lands. And these workers became part of the urban poor in southern cities and in southern towns. Many of them living, as you see in this picture, that comes to us from the West Virginia State Archives. Black business also struggled during this time. From the end of the Civil War to the early 1900s, blacks across the country, North, South, Midwest, had been developing within black communities their own businesses, banks, insurance companies, others that were more service-oriented, restaurants, beauty shops, and all of these came under great pressure during the Great Depression. Some black businesses collapsed during the Depression, others survived. And 2 examples of this, one that collapsed and one that survived, can be found in, first of all, the Benga Bank, and the second case, the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. Benga Bank was founded in 1908 and was Chicago's first black-owned and operated financial institution. The bank's president, Jesse Benga, held assets that were too heavily invested in mortgage loans that had been made to black churches and fraternal organizations. Jesse Benga refused to foreclose on these accounts during the Great Depression, recognizing that the community as a whole would suffer if these institutions went under. However, this eventually led to the collapse of his own business, the collapse of the Benga Bank by the mid-1930s. On the other hand, the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which had been founded 3 years earlier than the Benga Bank in 1905, took a different course. Alonzo Franklin Herndon cut investments in risky mortgages like those that had been made to churches, homeowners, and fraternal organizations. From 1931 to 1938, the company's assets actually increased by $1 million. And in general, insurance companies were critical to the economy of black communities and to individuals. Insurance companies were, in many cases, taking the place that mutual aid societies had once served in these communities. So where people might take their money out of the banks that were collapsing all around them, they viewed the insurance companies as a place that they could put money for any kind of rainy day occurrence. If someone died, then the insurance company would be there to provide them with assistance. Early relief measures during the Great Depression were often ineffective, regardless of who administered them, whether they were public or private. The problems of the Depression were too extensive for the traditional private charitable organizations to deal with. As unemployment spread and businesses closed, lowered tax receipts made it difficult for local and state governments to implement relief measures. There was also a philosophical reluctance on the part of government to undertake widespread relief measures. The prevailing idea was that government assistance would undermine the American work ethic. In other words, if people knew they could count on their government to bail them out of this economic crisis or provide a safety net in hard times, then the assumption was that they would be less inclined to look for jobs or to take whatever jobs they could get. But governments would help businesses during this crisis, even when they would not help the private individuals. And the idea here was that government assistance to businesses or to states, national government assistance to states, and state government and local government assistance to businesses would at some point trickle down to the workers themselves. However, as the Depression weakened the economy as a whole, this was less likely to occur. Now, let me just back up to one other thing that I said early in the lecture. In the 1920s, even though the government and American bankers were refusing to forgive the loans that they had made to European businesses or individuals or governments to help them finance World War I, they were continuing to collect on these. And they were continuing to bring in income tax revenues. Even though they were continuing to do this, what is actually happening is that government coffers, the government treasury is swelling. So during this Great Depression, as businesses collapse and people are unemployed, and the American economy is cycling down, the national government has funds, it has resources that they've been collecting from the debts, European debts, but also from income tax. So you've got national government with money that they are willing to lend to state governments and to channel into some big businesses. But they're not as willing to provide these resources in the early years of the Great Depression. In the period, for example, from 1929 to, let's say, 1932, the Hoover administration, they're not as willing to provide these resources to private individuals. The Great Depression also brought about some political changes, a political crisis that emerges that will, I should definitely have called this political change rather than political crisis, but there is a crisis situation that moves to a major political shift in the United States. And here we have to look very simply at how did African Americans respond to the Great Depression politically. In elections since the 1870s, African American voters were a critical component in the success of the Republican Party. When the Republican Party won elections, it was to a great extent, especially in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, it was to a great extent because they were able to count on the African American vote, because African Americans saw the party, the Republican Party, as the party of Abraham Lincoln and the party of emancipation. Many blacks maintained this traditional loyalty to the Republican Party into the 20th century. However, there had always been some crossover to other political parties, whether it was the Democratic Party or third parties like the Populist Party in the 1890s, or the Socialist Party in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Progressive reformers of the early 1900s had also drawn blacks into other parties, although progressivism as a political movement existed within both of the major parties, and eventually was its own political party, the Progressive Party, by the, say, 19-teens. Progressive reformers of the early 1900s again drew blacks into other parties, into both of the major parties, away from the Democratic Party. But the largest percentage of blacks remained in the Republican Party, where many black leaders held some influence on the national level as a result of party patronage. African Americans began to desert the Republican Party as early as the election of 1924. The reasons for this were that, first of all, there was some interest in breaking with tradition. There was not as much concern with patronage as with overall programs for the improvement in the conditions of African Americans. Second reason is that the Republicans were actually trying to build a stronger base among whites in the South. They were reaching out to Southern whites at the expense of prominent Southern blacks, or blacks nationally within the Republican Party. Men like Robert R. Church Jr. of Memphis lost influence as the National Party recognized white leaders in some Southern states and seated white delegates at the National Convention instead of black delegates. Black leaders refused to serve on a National Advisory Committee when this happened in 1924, and black newspapers started to back Democratic candidates. Some prominent Republicans, like Chicago's Arthur Mitchell, and we talked about him being elected as the first, let me back up. Arthur Mitchell switched parties from the Republican to the Democratic Party, and then he challenged Oscar DePriest, who was the first black elected to Congress since 1901. He challenged him for that seat in the House of Representatives in the election of 1928, challenged him and won. He became the first black Democrat to sit in Congress. Franklin Roosevelt had some support from black voters in the election of 1932, and here is where you begin to see a very critical change in electoral politics in the country, as African Americans began to make significant shifts out of the Republican Party and into the Democratic Party. The election of 1932 was the last election in which black voters could effectively be ignored by the Republican Party, ignored in the sense that they thought they always could count on the Republican vote, the black vote for its party's candidates. Roosevelt's personalized approach to politics, particularly the fireside chats or receiving African American visitors at the White House, his appointment of black advisors, and his outreach to black organizations and institutions all brought blacks to the Democratic Party. Blacks also felt that New Deal relief and recovery policies helped their communities and helped them individually. The New Deal, of course, was the program that was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Young black men between 18 and 35 worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or in Civilian Conservation Corps camps, and sent their pay home to help support their families. Other relief programs like the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, and the National Youth Administration included African Americans in among their leaders, as well as the people who would gather support or be able to get some support from them. However, although New Deal programs benefited some blacks, other programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Recovery Administration tended to be inadequate and unfairly administered. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's personal friendship with black educator Mary McLeod Bethune also drew many blacks to the Democratic Party. Mrs. Roosevelt visited black schools, and she invited the National Council of Negro Women, of which Mary McLeod Bethune was a leader, to visit the White House. All of these things tended to draw black attention to the Democratic Party and to make it seem more acceptable that blacks could make that transition out of the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. For many blacks, it just seemed that the Democratic Party was offering them solutions to their economic problems, solutions that the Republican Party was not, and that the Republican Party, on the other hand, was taking blacks for granted, taking the black vote for granted, and was actually reaching out to Southern whites rather than trying to build on that base of support among Southern blacks. In the election of 1936, more black newspapers and groups supported Franklin Roosevelt, as the African American vote actually became critical, a very critical part of a Democratic coalition that included labor, urban voters, ethnic voters, and strangely enough, the still solidly Democratic South. It was this coalition that secured the election of Roosevelt in 1936, in 1940, and again in 1944. Okay, looking at some of the New Deal policies, you remember from earlier courses, or perhaps your high school courses, that the New Deal was based on a philosophy of immediate relief, then recovery of the agricultural and the industrial sectors of the economy, and then some permanent reforms. In general, New Deal agencies reflected traditions of discrimination in American society. So although they don't create new discrimination, they also don't permanently break or extensively break these major barriers. They don't tear down segregation. They just simply reinforce it in a different sense. And we'll see this in just a minute when we talk about some of these agencies, but then also about the way in which Roosevelt draws black leaders or advisors into his administration. The National Industrial Recovery Act was one example of a New Deal agency, the NIRA, which established what they call codes of fair competition and provided a minimum wage scale. The wage scale was $12 to $15 a week for a 40-hour week, also provided for abolition of child labor under the age of 16. However, few African Americans were represented their groups at these code hearings, and cost of living differentials discriminated against groups in which black workers were found. When wages were raised by the NIRA, black workers were frequently fired, and higher wages were then paid to the white workers who were left on these jobs. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration provided some benefits for African American farmers, but these tended to be dissipated and misappropriated. Landlords took advantage of illiterate sharecroppers and tenant farmers and sometimes kept the checks that were intended for them. Black and white farmers organized into the STFU, where when these rules were changed to make payments directly to the tenants, STFU is the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And when they changed the rules, the government changed the rules of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to make payments more directly to tenant farmers. And then the landlords, in turn, threw the tenant farmers off the land. Then the Southern Tenant Farmers Union launched a major protest in some Midwestern and Southern states. And this was an organization that drew in both black and white farmers. Some programs like TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, or Rural Electrification Administration, or the Federal Land Bank, did provide benefits, but not in proportion to the numbers of blacks who might be affected. The National Youth Administration, the NYA, was a liberal relief program. However, the way in which the dividends, or the way in which it helped people, tended to be based on what already existed within society. Now, by this I mean that Mary McLeod Bethune was a very influential leader within the NYA, but she was the leader of what was essentially termed the Negro Division, and she dealt primarily with policies or with individuals that could help black youth, but not with policies or individuals that would help all youth. So essentially what you have is, again, recognizing these same traditional patterns of discrimination that existed in society and trying to provide relief without breaking down the patterns of discrimination, just saying, this is what is, now we have to deal with it. So let's just figure out a way that we can provide some relief and assistance for African Americans within a segregated society. African American young people, for example, when the federal government established the Civilian Conservation Corps camps, young men between the ages of 18 and 35 would be sent to these camps, and they would provide they would work on some public works projects. About 200,000 blacks worked in the camps or were within the camps. However, they were in segregated camps for the most part. They were able to receive some educational as well as relief benefits, which they could, again, some money, which they could channel back to their families to help them. But segregation maintained. Housing programs help blacks to keep their homes. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, for example, and others like the Federal Housing Administration, other programs like the Federal Housing Administration also helped. But community banks were not inclined to lend money to African Americans. Community programs were not inclined to lend money to African Americans. Community banks weren't. The most beneficial programs were those where the federal government encouraged local authorities to construct low-cost housing projects with subsidies from the U.S. Housing Authority. This is a period when you began to see some of those housing projects develop, and about 1/3 of these units would be occupied by African Americans. Now, one of the most interesting things that does happen during the Great Depression, one of the things that Roosevelt is most noted for, is the creation of what is termed his Black Cabinet. FDR adopted a policy of putting black specialists and advisors in various government departments. Previous presidential administrations had appointed blacks to high positions, but there were more in FDR's administration, and they actually had more power than blacks in previous administrations. This contingent of presidential advisors was referred to as Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. They were not a part of his official presidential cabinet. They were simply his advisors, and for the most part, they served in what we could term race-specific roles in particular agencies or departments. For example, the Black Cabinet included William Henry Hastie, who was the assistant solicitor in the Department of the Interior, Robert C. Weaver, who was the racial advisor in the Department of the Interior, Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, Will Alexander, who advised on African American problems in the Farm Security Administration, and Robert Vann, who was a special assistant for African American matters to the Attorney General. These advisors, and in this picture you see a group of them, and I believe, no, she's not in this picture. Excuse me, I thought maybe that we had, we could see Mary McLeod Bethune in this picture, but she's not. Mary McLeod Bethune actually was the person who called together this group of black advisors, and who was instrumental in, I guess you could say, getting people to view them as the black cabinet. Bethune and also black newspapers and journalists. These advisors were not politicians. They were highly trained people, a kind of a black brain trust of lawyers, PhDs, and college presidents. Bethune, for example, was the president of Bethune-Cookman College that she had actually developed herself. By the mid-1930s, Roosevelt had appointed 45 African Americans to serve in his New Deal agencies. FDR's black advisors were opposed to the idea of creating a separate Negro division or Negro bureau within the federal government, where everything, all matters relating to black people would be dealt with in this single bureau, very much like the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They were opposed to this because they felt that this would tend to make blacks seem to be wards of the government and would actually perpetuate segregation. And it's important to note that even though these advisors were working primarily or almost solely within their departments or their agencies on matters that dealt to African Americans, they were people who tended to feel that segregation at some point needed to break down. They were not they were not concerned, or they were not really in favor of reinforcing segregation on a permanent basis. They were just simply concerned at this point with looking out for the problems that affected African Americans in a segregated society. These people tended to, for example, secure employment for blacks on the basis of ability and training, or they tried to do this rather than color. However, one thing that became very clear is that most of the jobs that they secured were at a very low level. Now, during the same period, if we look at the premier agency of protest during this period, the NAACP, what we begin to see is that there are some internal struggles that are affecting the NAACP. And I'd like for you to just be sure to take a look at the information on pages 376 to 378 to see what is going on with this internal conflict that is emerging, and that is really centering around two very strong personalities. Walter White, who is the head of the NAACP at this time, and W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, of course, was one of the founders. Du Bois, at this point, in the 1930s, is the editor of The Crisis, which is the magazine of the NAACP. And in many cases, Du Bois uses The Crisis as kind of an official organ for his own personal views and philosophies. I think that's one of the most important things that we see in The Crisis, the pages of The Crisis magazine, from the early period, say 1919, all the way through to the mid-1930s, is that many of the editorials, for example, were written by W.B. Du Bois. They reflected his ideas, but they were ideas up until this point that it seemed to be in line with the ideas of the organization as a whole. However, things began to change in the 30s. In part 3 of The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, some of you may remember that very interesting segment about this conflict that is emerging between the two. Du Bois and some other members of the NAACP were very critical of Walter White's what they call dedicated but uninspiring leadership. Du Bois argued that the NAACP should work for economic as well as political change, and that it should, quote, according to your author, view America's racial problems through an international lens. So that's two things that he wants them to do. Number one, work for economic and political change. Du Bois is seeing these as linked, that it's not just a question of political disfranchisement or segregation. It is the economics of the America that are also restricting opportunities for African Americans. And he also wanted to shift civil rights struggle to the international stage. Du Bois had been one of the people, one had been an African American, or not a representative of Black America, but he had been one of the people attending the Versailles Peace Conference at the end of World War II. And he was pushing ideas of Pan-Africanism, which, of course, if we look at the ideas of other people, this was not a foreign idea during this period. Foreign, I shouldn't even say that, but Pan-African. Pan-Africanism was just the general belief that people of African descent all over the world shared certain economic, social, and political problems. We could say that Marcus Garvey, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, were another example of Pan-Africanist thinking during this period. So you've got two very prominent Pan-African leaders in the 1920s and into the 1930s, W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Although these two men did not like each other, they distrusted each other. They were constantly at odds. And, you know, people like Du Bois probably contributed to the downfall of Marcus Garvey, in the sense that it was the mainstream civil rights leaders or whatever who were most critical of Garvey and who may have drawn the attention of the federal government toward the weaknesses within Garvey's program. In any event, by the 1930s, Du Bois is challenging Walter White and saying that we have to think more internationally about the struggles of people of African descent. Du Bois was also wanted to bring the talented 10th more into the mainstream of helping to define economic as well as civil rights goals for the NAACP. He called together what became known as the Amenia Conference in 1933. And at this conference, he gathered Black professionals and academics like Ralph Bunche, Charles Hamilton Houston, E. Franklin Frazier, and Abram Harris. And he solicited their views on social and economic justice, including interracial efforts to unionize industrial workers. However, Du Bois at this point rejected communist calls for violent revolution. Du Bois published his ideas in a crisis editorial entitled Segregation, and this led to a breach between Du Bois and White and other NAACP leaders who again felt that Du Bois was using the Crisis magazine to publicize his personal views. Du Bois resigned from the NAACP and resigned from the editorship of Crisis magazine at this point, and began to move in his own in a different direction to achieve the goals that he felt needed to be accomplished. This is also a period when you begin to see challenges to discrimination making their way through the federal courts, or through the state courts and the federal courts. This whole campaign of legal challenge, particularly from the NAACP, is led by Charles Hamilton Houston. Houston believed in what he described as a two-pronged strategy for challenging segregation, or challenging, very simply, separate but equal. He felt that the first thing that you should do is force the equalization side of this idea. If people wanted separate but equal, then force governments and school systems to make things truly equal. If they were going to keep them separate, make them truly equal. And what Hamilton theorized was that if you force communities to do this, then equalization would become so expensive that they would eventually opt to end segregation. They would end the separate because they couldn't afford the equal. one of the first things that Charles Hamilton Houston did was to make a widespread survey of conditions in the South. He traveled in the South in the country. He traveled around Southern communities. He gathered statistics on the cost of operating these dual school systems, statistics that would prove that things were not equal, that black school children were receiving much lower, much less in terms of educational funding. It would also become very clear that black teachers were paid less than white teachers. Black administrators were paid less than white administrators. And from that point, he began to push, first of all, toward the equalization of teachers' salaries. And with that, once that was done in some Southern communities, he did, in effect, draw the support of one of the most influential elements within the black community, and that was the black teachers. After he has moved in the direction of challenging the equal in terms of teacher pay, then he moves in the direction of challenging the equal in terms of graduate and professional schools. These are some of the earliest of the court cases that are brought to first the state courts and then the federal courts. In 1938, you have the case of Gaines versus Canada in the state of Missouri, where the Missouri State Supreme Court is asked to address this question of a state-supported law school for black citizens. There was no state-supported law school for black citizens, so they were going to have to create one. And rather than create a separate black law school, which they could not afford, the Missouri State Supreme Court ruled that they would integrate the University of Missouri Law School. In 1947, you have the case of Scipio, Ada Lois Scipio versus the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. Oklahoma was granting out-of-state tuitions for black students so that they would not push to attend the all-white state institutions, graduate and professional schools. And the court ordered Oklahoma to provide facilities in the home state for these students. In other words, rather than admit a black student to the University of Oklahoma graduate school, Oklahoma, the state legislature, would move to create a separate black graduate school. The Oklahoma state legislature would provide tuition grants for black students to go to other state graduate schools that provided the programs that they did not want to admit blacks to in their own state. And the court said, no, you couldn't do this. Separate but equal meant that the state had to provide for these facilities within their own state. In 1950, you have the case of Sweat v. Painter. Again, it's the question of separate but equal in a law school. Rather than admit black students to the University of Texas Law School, they were simply creating their own law school. The state legislature would create a separate black law school. And the Supreme Court at this point, because these cases were moving out of state courts into the Supreme Court, ruled that Texas could not do this, that a law school was more than just a building, and that creating a separate law school for blacks did not resolve this question of separate but equal. You would have the separate building, but it would not provide equal training to blacks in the field of law, so that they would have to admit blacks to the University of Texas Law School. In the 1920s and into the 1940s, the NAACP and other organizations also began to target disfranchisement of black voters. They focused on the 1923 law in Texas, the Terrell Law, that denied blacks a vote in Democratic primaries. They said that this was the equivalent of being disfranchised, since the Democratic primary had become the major method for selecting candidates who would then move on to the offices that they were running for, since there was no serious Republican challenge. The Democratic primaries had become essentially all white primaries, and were viewed in some cases, the primary election was viewed as a private club. This case in 1944 of Smith v. Allwright, which ended the all-white primary, was seen as the NAACP's greatest legal victory to date. And then finally, in the 1930s, you had a very interesting case, the case of the Scottsboro Boys. You should be able to describe this case based on the information on pages 367 to 375. But more importantly, what you see happening here is the increasing role of the International Labor Defense Fund, or essentially the Communist Party, the American Communist Party, in trying to give some kind of legal support to the Scottsboro Boys, the defendants in this alleged rape case. As the case moves into the Supreme Court with the backing of the ILD, you have two important Supreme Court decisions. The first is in 1932 in Powell versus Alabama, and it is a question of the right of a defendant to have adequate legal counsel. And the second is in the case of Norris v. Alabama in 1935, where defendants have a right to a trial by a jury of their peers. And the idea of being, in this case, was that denying or excluding black jurors from a trial was not in line with the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So you see that in the 1930s, during this period of the Great Depression, you begin to see growing protests on the part of African American organizations, protests against economic as well as political and social, political disfranchisement and segregation. You begin to see important blacks moving into positions within the federal government as advisors to the president during the Great Depression. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at what happens during World War II. And what we're beginning to see is a gradual buildup of opposition to segregation. And this opposition takes the form of court challenges. Charles Hamilton Houston recognizing that the battle over segregation is going to be fought primarily, most importantly, in the schools. And then beginning this challenge with equalization of public school teacher salary, but also taking it to the graduate and professional schools. So desegregation is working its way down from the highest levels of education. And by the 1950s, it will get to this question of segregation in public schools. Graduate and professional schools are, in a sense, protected settings because you don't have the widespread public admission to graduate and professional schools. But when you get to the question of public school education, that's where desegregation is going to touch everybody. So in the next lecture, we'll look at World War II.